Welcome to iTTV for Form 3 Science, where we begin our journey into the world of respiration. Today's lesson, Respiratory System. One of the important things that we learn is our human body, which is a multicellular organism type body, needs to have systems that allow us to function. The whole point of a system is so that it can move or transport or send messages around our body efficiently and quickly. One of these systems is called the respiratory system. And the function of the respiratory system is very simple. Get oxygen from the air and get it into our blood as fast as possible. At the same time, get the carbon dioxide, the product of respiration, out of the blood and out of our body as fast as possible. So this is really the whole concept or the idea behind the respiratory system. And everything about the respiratory system, its design and function, is geared around gaseous exchange, bringing the oxygen in and removing carbon dioxide. Energy is produced by oxidizing glucose. So what happens in the body is glucose and oxygen are burnt. And when they're burnt together, energy is produced. It is this energy that we use as the fuel for our living processes. The process by which energy is released from glucose is known as respiration. You must remember respiration. You must know the equation for respiration, and also you must realize that all living things do respiration, and they do respiration, or they do this process of respiration in order to produce energy that they need in order to survive. Glucose combines with oxygen in the cells to release energy, and this is the respiration process. The glucose obviously comes from our diet, what we eat, and the oxygen comes from the air around us. The equation for respiration is glucose plus oxygen produces energy and carbon dioxide and water. The energy is what we want, it's what we use. The carbon dioxide and the water, they are byproducts, or sometimes we call them waste products, and they need to be removed from the body. Glucose comes from the digestion of carbohydrates. So glucose comes from carbohydrates when we digest it in our body. Where does the oxygen come from? So this is the question that we need to answer. We know where the glucose comes from. We studied this in Chapter 2 of Form 2, Nutrition. We know that when carbohydrates are digested, glucose is the product. But where does the oxygen come from? Air. The oxygen comes from air. How do we get the oxygen into our body? This is the question that we need to look at and answer during today's lesson. So where does the oxygen come from? The oxygen comes from breathing. By breathing, we bring the air into our body and we get the oxygen that we need. By breathing, we also remove the carbon dioxide, that waste product of respiration. Breathing, the process which involves an exchange of gases with the environment. So this is the definition of breathing. Look, you must know definitions. They always come out in examinations, and also it's a very easy way of explaining a process to someone. If someone asked you what is breathing, you need to say, well, we are exchanging gas with the environment. We are taking oxygen from the environment and we are giving carbon dioxide back to the environment. It's not a bad thing. This is part of nature. By giving oxygen, or I beg your pardon, taking oxygen and giving carbon dioxide, we help to maintain the balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our air. So remember, breathing is the exchange of gases with the environment. A human being breathes by using the human respiratory system. So this is what I was saying earlier. In order for us to get the oxygen into our body and then send it to all parts of our body, we need to have a specialized system. The system is called the respiratory system. The organs in the respiratory system are nasal cavity, trachea or windpipe, bronchi, diaphragm, ribs, throat or pharynx, lungs, bronchioles, intercostal muscles, alveoli. That's quite a lot to remember, isn't it? Don't worry about it. As we go through this lesson, we will look at each of these organs and their functions, and you'll sort of start to remember where they are and what their names are. And any of the organs that we don't look at this lesson, we certainly will in the coming lessons. So remember, the respiratory system contains a lot of organs: the nasal cavity, trachea, bronchi, diaphragm, ribs, throat, lungs, bronchiole, intercostal muscles, and alveoli. Now that we've had a basic look at the respiratory system, let's try a few questions to test what we've already grasped. Name 3 organs in the respiratory system. I'm not asking you to name all of them, I just need 3. The 3 main ones, if you can think of them. There has to be this area here, coming in here at the beginning. If you can think of 3, that would be fantastic. Let's have a look. Nasal cavity, trachea, lungs. Now these 3 represent the main 3. The nasal cavity, where the air enters, the trachea that brings the air down, and the lungs, which is the final area where your air goes. Let's try another question. The exchange of gases with the surrounding is called. Remember what we said just now? We need to change gases with the surrounding. We take in oxygen, we give back out the carbon dioxide. The name of this process is breathing. So breathing, the exchange of gases with the surrounding. One last question. What is the process which releases energy from glucose? Now, this is the most important process that I can think of that occurs in the body. If it doesn't occur, well, we wouldn't occur. So do you know the name? The process when energy is released from glucose is known as respiration. So remember, the process that produces energy in our bodies is called respiration. Now that we've done those questions, let's jump into the respiratory system and have a look at how air actually travels in and gets to our lungs and finally enters into the bloodstream. Let's follow an oxygen molecule on its journey to respiration. Firstly, oxygen enters the nose through the nostrils. The walls of the nostrils are lined with hairs to trap dust particles. So the first area that oxygen enters is our nose, and to enter the nose, we enter through these 2 small perforations at the bottom of our nose called nostrils. To have a look at this in a bit more detail, let's move up to the board and draw our way through the process. So the first thing that happens here is that oxygen, just to make life a bit simple, the chemical symbol for oxygen is O2. Okay, so I'm going to write O2 here, rather than use the word oxygen each time. So the first thing that happens is the oxygen enters through this opening at the bottom, which is called the nostril. Inside the nostril, we have tiny hairs, and the function of the hair is to trap any dust that's coming in. Now, once we move from the nostril, we enter into the next area, which is up here, which is a large opening. This opening is called the nasal cavity. So that's the second place that we're going to go. We'll go there in a moment on the slides, but let's deal with it here now. So we enter through the nostrils into the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity has a thin layer of mucus. And the function of the mucus is to trap any bacteria or dust that the nose hairs have not been able to stop, and to prevent these things from moving down into our lungs. So, nostrils into the nasal cavity. Now, let's move on our journey. So we've entered into the nostril. Next, we enter the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity secretes mucus. So this is the mucus that's coming out. Remember what we said, the function of the mucus was to trap some dust and bacteria. Mucus traps bacteria and other foreign particles in the inhaled air. Then it's the trachea. The trachea does not collapse because it is kept open by the rings of cartilage. So once we've got to the nasal cavity, now we have to move on to the next part, which is the trachea. Let's go back to the board for the trachea. So we are here at the nasal cavity. Now from the nasal cavity, we continue down like so, and this tube that goes down here is called the trachea. Trachea. Now, the trachea, because air is moving in and out of this trachea, we need to make sure that the trachea doesn't shut close. So, in order to make sure that the trachea does not shut close, the inside of the trachea has these rings of cartilage. Cartilage is quite strong material, not very elastic. So, inside your trachea, you've got these rings of cartilage. And these rings of cartilage help keep the trachea open all the time. The last thing you need is for your trachea to close, because if it closes, it's going to cause trouble. Now, when you've gone down the trachea, the next area we go to, so what we'll do is, we'll pull an arrow and continue over here. As we travel down the trachea, okay, put in a few rings of cartilage here. As we travel down the trachea now is going to branch into two branches that come out like this. These branches, one will go to one lung and the other one goes to the other lung. These branches are called bronchus. So, remember, this is the trachea. So from the trachea, we are now going to move into the bronchus. So we're in the trachea now, and remember, the trachea has these rings of cartilage in it to make sure that it doesn't close. The trachea branches into a left bronchus and a right bronchus. We enter into the right bronchus. So we've gone through nostril, nasal cavity into our trachea. Our trachea now branches into two branches, the left and right bronchus. We'll just follow the journey into the right bronchus. The bronchus then branches into smaller tubes called bronchioles. So we are now spreading out and moving out into the lungs. And in order to get to all areas of the lungs, the bronchus breaks into a whole bunch of branches called the bronchioles. Let's go back to the board and have a look at how this happens. So we're here in the trachea, we've come down, we've moved into the bronchus. Now the bronchus, which is inside the lung, has to split into all these different areas. So here we start splitting into smaller tubes. And then these tubes split further into smaller tubes, like so, and then we get our bronchioles. Now, at the end of the bronchiole, which is the end of our journey, there sits a sac. Yeah, like I said, a sac, S-A-C. This sac is called the alveolar sac. The sac basically kind of looks like this, and that really is the final place the oxygen needs to go. So, just here on the board, let's quickly follow oxygen's pathway for a moment. Oxygen is here. It enters through the nostril. The hairs trap some dust. It moves into the nasal cavity where the mucus is trapping any bacteria or any foreign particles. From the nasal cavity, we move into the trachea and start to move down the trachea. The trachea is kept open by these special rings of cartilage that keep it opened. So now let's jump over to the second diagram. We are with the trachea flowing down. We flow down. We have a choice. We can go either into the right or the left bronchus. We'll go into the right bronchus. The bronchus breaks into the bronchioles. We'll follow this bronchiole all the way until we reach the alveolus. So suddenly now the oxygen is in the alveolus. Let's just label these last couple of things. This was called the bronchiole, and this is known as the alveolus. Now, these are the main parts of your respiratory system that you really need to know. Nostrils, nasal cavity, trachea, bronchus, bronchiole, and alveolus. The other parts of the system, they sit on the outside. They help in the process of respiration, but they're not so essential for what we are doing today. So remember all these parts, because these are the kind of things that will come out in your examination, so you need to know them all. Let's continue on the slides with the journey. We've gone into the bronchus, and then remember the bronchus has broken into smaller tubes, which we call the bronchioles. The bronchioles end at the alveoli. So now we've reached the alveoli, and now from the alveoli, we've got to get this oxygen into the blood system. The oxygen molecule enters the blood capillary by diffusion. Now, you've learned diffusion in Form 1, in Chapter 3 of Matter. Just remember, diffusion is where particles move from high concentration to low concentration. In the alveoli, there is a lot of oxygen. In the blood, there is just a little bit of oxygen. So the alveoli has high concentration of oxygen, the capillary low concentration of oxygen. Therefore, oxygen will naturally diffuse from the alveoli into the blood. Remember, you go from high concentration to low concentration. Oxygen combines with hemoglobin on the red blood cell and is carried away with the blood. So now, once the oxygen goes into the bloodstream, it will join up onto the red blood cell. The red blood cell has a special pigment called hemoglobin. The function of hemoglobin is to actually catch and bond with these oxygen molecules. Each hemoglobin is able to carry 1 or 4 oxygen molecules. It depends on the amount of oxygen and how fast the system is working. At optimum, it will carry 4 oxygens each. The passage of air in the human respiratory system is nostril, nasal cavity, trachea, bronchus, bronchiole, alveolus. You must know this pathway. This is a common question that comes out in your examinations. Now, to complete this lesson, let's try a quick question on what we've done so far. What is the passage of air through the respiratory system? We've just had a look at it. Try to recall it. Start from the very beginning, second place, third place, fourth, fifth, sixth. There's 6 areas that we need, or 6 stops along the pathway. Take your time, write it down. Okay, let's compare our answers. The pathway is nostril, nasal cavity, trachea, into the bronchus, bronchiole, and finally the alveolus. So remember the key things about your respiratory system. Remember, we need to do respiration. Glucose comes from our digestion of carbohydrates. The oxygen comes from the air. To get the oxygen, we have to do a process called breathing, which is gas exchange. In order to do this gas exchange, we use what is called the respiratory system. The flow of air into our body is particular. It follows a set pathway. Nostrils, nasal cavity, into the trachea, which leads down to the 2 bronchus, which break into the 2 lungs. Each bronchus breaks into more finer tubes called bronchioles, and the bronchioles end at the alveolar sac, where the gas exchange takes place and our beautiful oxygen enters into our bloodstream and is carried away to our cells. That's all the time we have for today's lesson. Thank you very much for watching iTTV.